Good evening and welcome to the sixth and final lecture of our online series, Scientifically Speaking. Our aim with the Scientifically Speaking series is to introduce you to cutting-edge research and innovative teaching techniques. We have a new topic and an expert every time you join us, and we go on a journey together to explore a subject area from the perspective of data and science. I'm Shweta, your host and moderator for the evening. I'm a second-year undergraduate here at Ashoka University. I'm currently pursuing a computer science major and a minor in biology. Well, I'm no expert, but I'm keen, like all of you here, to hear what our speaker has in store for us today. Today's speaker is Dr. Bittu, who's already quite popular amongst those who attended the Beyond the Classroom series of webinars. Professor Bittu is currently the Associate Professor of Biology and Psychology at Ashoka University. Prior to joining us, Professor Bittu was an Inspire faculty at the Central University of Hyderabad. Bittu received his PhD from Harvard University in neuroscience, where he studied the intrinsic photosensitivity in salamander retinae. He was then a DSc Dr. D.S. Kothari postdoctoral fellow at IISc Bangalore Center for Ecological Sciences, where he studied the evolution of neural and behavioral systems of communication among orthopteran insects in response to ecological constraints. To give you a little more context about what I'm doing here, I work in Bittu's neuroethology lab at Ashoka, and I'm currently the overlord of the zebrafish who are most indebted to me for keeping them alive during the lockdown. What's been absolutely great is that Bittu allowed me to tail him around in the lab from my very first semester here, and I was immediately given the opportunity to assist senior lab members to conduct behavioral experiments and to try and woo Madame Crickets into playing along. I'm currently working with Professor Bittu to try and understand and simulate central pattern generator circuits in crickets, and it's been quite the exciting journey. Before we begin, I need to lay out a few logistics for you before we get on with the actual stuff. I'll be interviewing Professor for about 30 minutes, during which you can ask your questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom. You can choose to share your name or send it in anonymously. It's completely up to you. All seminars are recorded and will be uploaded on the Ashoka University YouTube page for those of you who wish to revisit or share with friends. Lastly, and most excitingly, there'll be a quiz to test what you've taken away from today's lecture. Top 5 winners will definitely get a special gift, and so I'd suggest you pay attention. So, welcome, Professor Bittu.
Thanks, Shweta. Thanks for hosting.
How's your day been?
Good. We're near about our grading deadlines, so hectic.
Yeah, well. So, I'm going to ask you to give us a brief introduction about what you're going to be talking about today and how you came to be interested in this particular area.
Okay. Well, I'll be talking about whether animals can count today. And while that particular question is something that I've developed and interested in sort of somewhat recently, I've, as a kid, when I first started getting interested in neuroscience, all of us get interested in behavior at a fairly young age. In fact, by the age of 3 or so, we're busily trying to figure out what other people are thinking. Right? That's a lot of what development involves. And so as one navigates the world, one is wondering why one thinks the way one does. And one's also trying to figure out why other people think the way that they do, or what they're thinking. And so in some sense, throughout high school, which is when you're sort of really throwing a lot of material at yourself, you're educating yourself on all kinds of things. I was persistently interested by this question of how it is that my brain did some of these kinds of thinking, right? So when you learn something new and difficult, which always happens in math classes, for example, you're getting familiar with fairly new concepts. You find some easier and others harder. You encounter sort of mental blocks in terms of what feels intuitive and what doesn't. And so I was always interested in how it is that, what constitutes a mental block, what constitutes ready and easy learning. And in general, numerical cognition is something that a lot of humans find quite difficult, a lot of animals find quite difficult as well. Whereas in fact, things that we think of as very easy things to do, like recognize one another, or figure out whether another person is smiling at you and whether it's what kind of smile it is. These are very, very complicated tasks, and we don't even consider those to be abilities simply because they seem to sort of flow somewhat intuitively from the workings of a very large number of neurons in the brain. So I was interested in then what constitutes, what constitutes learning, what constitutes, what feels perceptually easy, what feels perceptually difficult, and why? What does it even mean to do math? So now I've gotten very interested in this question, and I'm, our work on this is very preliminary, but because the question is such fun, I thought I would still share it with all of you.
Right, so to just get you started, I have a few questions for you. So do we have an inkling about what it actually means to have an ability to do math? And oftentimes we associate symbolic numbers to the ability to do math, to handle those symbols. So are symbols intrinsic to the abstract notion of, say, numbers? And if so, are non-human animals capable of doing the same kind of math that we are?
Mm-hmm.
What would that mean?
Yeah. I mean, this is the question. We do some tasks in which we involve symbols and other tasks in which we don't. So maybe what I'll do is jump into what I want to share with all of you, and you'll quickly get a sense of this. I think the first thing that I'd like to share with all of you is this question of what it even means for an animal to count. So let's first look at whether animals can count, and then we'll look into what it actually means for animals to produce. So I'm not sort of interested in convincing you with anything other than direct evidence, right? So I'm going to start off by playing you a couple of videos of animals demonstrating their counting abilities. And then we'll look at, these are animals that I think can count. We'll look at what it means to count as opposed to just estimate quantity after that. And then we'll look at a whole bunch of other animals that do something between quantitative estimation and counting. So take a look at this chimp. These are chimps tested in the lab of Tetsuro Matsuzawa. So I want you to take a look at the tasks that these chimps do. And I want you to also try and do this task while the chimp is doing it. So what the chimp does in this task is to see a bunch of numbers across the screen, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The chimp has an understanding of the ordering of these numbers. So the chimp gets a reward when the chimp goes, presses 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4 and then 5. Right? This is not the own. I mean, establishing that chimps can do this does not constitute a proof of counting, but it does constitute proof of symbolic ordering. And that's one component of what one would want to establish as part of looking at whether chimps can do maths. All right, so I want you to see if you can do this ordering task along with the chimps as you watch this video.
His star pupil is a 7-year-old chimpanzee. Show him the numbers 1 to 9, and he'll put them in the right order, pointing to them one by one. Every time he gets it right, he receives a treat, a tiny piece of apple or half a raisin. But now, the researchers make things difficult. As soon as the chimp presses the number 1, the rest of the numbers are hidden. He has to remember where the numbers were and press the white squares in numerical order. The positioning of the numbers is totally random. He gets it right time after time with lightning speed and 100% accuracy.
All right, so not only can chimps do numerical ordering tasks, or shall we say for now symbolic ordering, because I haven't shown you evidence of them being able to do other kinds of numerical manipulations yet. But this is a particular ability that I wanted to demonstrate to you, because in starting off with a task that a chimp can do better than a human being, I'm hoping to sort of move us away from this assumed paradigm that human beings are the best at all tasks. I mean, certainly we know that human beings are not good at various things. We're obviously not very good at flying, with our own bodies. Several other abilities that we don't have. But cognitively as well, there are several tasks that other animals do that we don't. And numerical ordering, which is a particular point of pride for humans, clearly is also something that that some other animals can perform better than us. Now, of course, in this task, what the chimp is essentially doing is remembering a stimulus that gets masked and seems to be able to remember it much better than we can in order to then carry out the task of tapping the squares in order. In general, children perform slightly better at this task than adults among humans, but we still fail miserably compared to chimpanzees. All right, I'd like you to think a little bit about what other animals you might guess show numerical abilities. And perhaps we will, it's in general, it's quite fun to think about what guesses people might have. Most people sort of jump from humans to chimpanzees, again, based on an extension of the same kind of reasoning that makes sort of people get somewhat surprised by this chimp video, which is, well, humans must be the best at everything. And so animals that are closely related to us, evolutionarily speaking, chimpanzees, might be second best, right? That's the assumption that often goes into first turning to primates. And not just chimpanzees, but primates in general are the subject of a lot of research on numerical cognition. You might find surprising, so here is an example.
How many? Two. Two is right. Good boy. What color bigger?
So,
what color bigger? None. Very good. Okay.
I just wanted to briefly demonstrate to you the fact that these are African gray parrots, and the person working with them is Irene Pepperberg. Alex, the parrot featured in this video, was very famous. He was trained for a very long period of time. Now, there's a distinction between the video that I showed you earlier of the chimps in Tetsuro Matsuzawa's lab and this work in Pepperberg's lab. In Matsuzawa's lab, the testing is in a lab and it's entirely automated, right? So there's no other human being in the room with the chimp. The chimp sits, these chimps actually have a very nice, large outdoor gym where they play. And when they feel like playing essentially video games, which is what the task involves, they come into this experimental room of their own accord, right? So they're not being kind of dragged in there or being made to work. As you can see, Alex is much more interested in treats at this moment than he is in the task at hand. The chimps initiate the game by touching an automated, video game setup, and then the task gets presented, and then the rewards are also distributed to the chimpanzee in an automated form. Now, it took several years of experimentation with chimpanzees, much of which was extremely hands-on, of the kind that Pepperberg did with Alex. So of course, Jane Goodall was the pioneering person who worked with chimpanzees. Lots and lots of hours of field work around chimpanzees, lab work as well on chimpanzee language and cognition for many, many years. Led up to the point where it was conceivable to imagine a way by which to test chimpanzee numerical abilities in a setup where there are no cues being provided by human beings. That's quite important because as the story of Hans, a horse from Germany who was thought to have numerical abilities, shows us, and this is a story that I talk about extensively in my first year of class for when I teach critical thinking and research methods. That's a warning tale because it turned out that what Hans was really, really good at was reading cues from researchers rather than actually doing mathematical tasks themselves. So in more work with parrots, one hopes that we'll have more automated setups to sort of look at this work. But Alex's responses to Pepperberg's questions are quite remarkable, right? Alex looks at a red block and a green block, which are roughly the same size, and says neither of these is bigger. Alex is able to look at 4 blocks, green blocks, and 2 red blocks, and say there are more green blocks. Count the number of keys that are presented by Pepperberg, and so on and so forth. And unlike chimpanzees, who on whom the readout has to involve the chimpanzee touching something, with monkeys, it usually involves monkeys pulling a lever or pressing something. The readout with Alex is extremely intuitive for humans to interpret because Alex actually uses human language, English, and like the aliens on Star Trek, Alex speaks with an American accent to boot, thereby convincing, Americans who think of other accents as being more foreign than aliens. So So yes, Alex is quite remarkable, therefore, but a lot more testing is needed to establish what Alex can do and to establish that Alex is not picking up on cues. And Pepperberg also designed tests very carefully to distinguish between these various possible interpretations of Alex's abilities. All right.
Professor, I have a question.
Yeah,
so
please.
What about animals that are further off on the tree of life, like insects and, say, fish? What about
Right. These are the animals that I work with. I work with insects and fish, and you might wonder why work with insects and fish? Why not sort of rest on animals that are closer to humans in the evolutionary tree? And so for me, at least, part of my interest in looking at other organisms is driven by the conviction that human beings are not the centerpiece of everything, and that one is just as likely to find interesting abilities when one's not looking, human at subsets of the animal world that are close to human beings. And so I will actually now present data from bees. And the reason that the bee data is so interesting is that bees seem to actually outperform several vertebrates in terms of their numerical abilities. And I think the work around bees and their numerical abilities is sort of quite remarkable and can actually be considered to considered all together. And I'm not going to go into the bee work in great detail, but I'll just give you a flavor of it to sort of establish the fact that bees can do some form of counting. Okay, so what might constitute numerical cognition? I mean, these are some of the questions that we'll need to ask before we look at other organisms. And the reason is as follows. When Alex and the parrot and the chimp in Matsuzawa's lab do these tasks, they are essentially raised in an extremely, and they're doing all of this work in extremely controlled environments. And essentially, in the case of Matsuzawa's chimps, they don't have to sing or do video games for their supper, but they do if they want these treats, which are these little bits of apples, which chimps and monkeys really, really like. These are what I would call quantifiable tests in labs. And you would need quantifiable tests in labs, such as quantitative comparisons, a comparison of two numbers, an ordering of numbers, sometimes similarity with a third number. So you show two numbers, and then you see whether animals can match this to a number that arrives later. Chimps can actually do both of these tasks. They can even sort of do fractional addition tasks and so on. And of course, what we think of as number as taught in a classroom, which is this initial association of symbols or linguistic sort of words. So the word one then corresponds to the number ONE, or written as an Arabic or Roman numeral. And then that then represents the concept of a single object, whether that single object is a pen or a pair of headphones, and so on and so forth, right? So this is how the work with Alex and the chimps has come along. But if one wants to understand what sort of enables numerical cognition to arise in evolutionary trajectories, one has to think of what about doing math is useful. Or even any quantitative estimates. And one finds quantitative estimates a lot more useful than this very specific sort of ability to do mathematical manipulations with discrete numbers. But certainly an ability to apprise quantity is something that you can understand could be adaptive in several contexts. And there's some work trying to quantify the benefits of being able to estimate quantity. So for example, with food quantity, suppose a monkey sees one tree with 200 fruits hanging off of it and another tree with only 50, the monkey may want to spend foraging time going to the tree with more fruit on it, right? You may want to also estimate predator quantity. So if you're keeping a track of how many predators you are encountering in one zone of the forest versus another, that's certainly useful because it can help avoid predator-rich zones. So useful to track food, predators, and friends. So with social cognition as well, you can imagine that counting the number of animals in a group. So suppose some group of animals comes at you in a territorial attack. the number of animals in the other group relative to your own group might be an important factor to consider when deciding whether to wage war or flee, right? So whether to sort of implement fight or flight. And then there's one more context in which numerical cognition might be helpful, and that's what I'm about to show you, which is the question of navigation and landmarks, right? So I'm in an unfamiliar zone, but if I want to sort of make my way back and noticing landmarks is part of how I as an animal navigate, one can imagine the usefulness of having circuitry that enables a counting of landmarks. And so let me show you what we know about bee navigation and landmarks, because this is very old data, whereas the quantifiable tests in labs that have been done with bees are relatively recent. So this is an example of the bee data. On top, you see what the bees are conditioned with. They leave the home, which is at 0. Right, this is just distance on the right, on the x-axis, and they move 200. I guess that's 200 paces away from home, and by then they sort of notice 3 landmarks. So those triangles are the landmarks, right? They pass 2 landmarks. They pass a feeder which is empty. Then they pass a 3rd landmark, and that feeder F1 is the one which has all the food. So in controlled conditions, the animals are just trained on this. And, after a flight in which they have done this, they are sent back home, and one sees where it is that these animals land. Now, on the y-axis is the proportion of choices. So you can see that in the control condition, when they know that the feeder F1, there are multiple ways in which bees might do this task. One way is for the bees to, and this is an example of the use of kind of mixed cues, right? So the animals have 2 cues here. When you navigate, what do? Well, sometimes you count the number of landmarks. So you say after 3 stoplights, this person's home is on the right. So one way that the bee might be doing this task is to count landmarks, in which case you have landmark 1, landmark 2, feeder, which you ignore, landmark 3, and then you see the feeder 1, which is associated with food. If bees are doing that calculation, then you would expect that in an experimental test condition, which you see below, that bees would, after the 3rd landmark, land on a feeder, expecting it to have food in it. If, however, bees are just using distance, so instead of counting landmarks, I say, well, I know I have to go a certain distance, and this is easier, of course, to do when you're walking than when you're driving in a car with variable speeds. But you have to walk a certain distance before you start counting landmarks or keeping track of landmarks. So this is, and with all ecologically relevant experiments, this is an example of an experiment with mixed cues. We don't know whether the bees would be counting landmarks or just going a certain distance and then looking around for a feeder. So in the test condition, where again 3 landmarks are shown, but the landmarks are crunched up in space such that feeder 2 now appears to be it's at the same position as before. But feeder 2 appears to arrive after 3 landmarks instead of after 2 in the control condition. One finds that a minority of bees land on feeder 2, presumably with the expectation that it has food in it. But still a majority of bees go and land on feeder 1, which is at the correct distance, but after the wrong number of landmarks. This is a very nice, I think, revealing study, because it looks at a population, and it finds that in the population, the majority of bees, which have been trained on finding F1 at a particular distance and after a particular number of landmarks, when these 2 cues are now confused with one another, or they disaggregate the cues, now F1 is still at the same position, but after a greater number of landmarks, and there's a distractor feeder 2, which is there after the correct number of landmarks, but a shorter distance. Most bees don't get confused by the change in the number of landmarks. They continue to use distance as the cue that directs them to F1. But a small minority of mathematically or numerically inclined bees who seem to be relying on counting landmarks more than on distance land on feeder 2 instead of feeder 1. This is something that one sees in ecologically relevant sort of training protocols. And it's important to contrast this with the results that you find from training individuals in the lab, because when you train individuals in the lab, you're not trying to get a sense of what these animals sort of do on their own, but one's trying to get a sense of what animals can do if you train them using a reward. And the results might be mixed. In several other examples of ecologically relevant testing, where you try and test animals on things, on tasks that might be actual ecologically relevant tasks that they do day to day, foraging, navigation, etc., one often finds that it's only a minority of animals that tend to use numerical cues over other cues when these cues are mixed together. And in ecologically relevant settings, these cues are often mixed together. So for example, if you're choosing which tree has more fruit on it, or which group has more predators in it, or which group has more friends in it, you're not just choosing based on the once being presented with mixed cues, because if a group has more animals in it, it typically also is going to cover more visual surface area. So you're actually not, it's difficult to provide an ecologically relevant task in which the number of animals is controlled for. That is to say, everything else that's mixed with that cue, such as more visual space taken up by a larger number of animals, more visual space taken up by a larger number of fruits, right? In a lab study, one would control for these, and one would see whether, even if these two take up the same number amount of surface area, that is to say, maybe you have smaller fruits in the numerically larger group such that there is only a difference in number and not a difference in, and in that case, you have to worry about other things. You may have a smaller sort of number of dots or fruits in front of the animal, but they may be smaller in size, in which case, the density of the fruits may be higher than for the other group. So in a lab, when one does this kind of testing, one has to really worry about whether one's only conveying numerical information to the animal versus mixed cues. But when mixed cues are presented, one can disaggregate those mixed cues to get a sense of how many animals are using one cue versus another. And one typically finds a minority of animals preferring mathematical cues over other sources of information. Okay, so what's the lab equivalent of the bee study? Bees have been trained to do these really interesting tasks in which there's a reference a board. Now, the bee sees a comparison task, which is on the hanger and below it. And bees can be trained in this paradigm. Remember, this is a lab paradigm. So one's training the animals and giving them rewards if they get things correctly. So in this case, the bee is shown a larger quantity and a smaller quantity. Now here, what is done is that the quantities that are shown, their sizes are randomized, such that the overall surface area taken up by not necessarily in a particular presentation of the stimulus, but in repeated presentations of the stimulus, the surface area, the density, and so on taken up by the stimulus which has more objects in it is equivalent to the stimulus that has fewer objects in it. So bees can be trained to do one of two things. In this case, for example, bees are trained to land on the smaller number, in that they get rewarded when they land on the smaller number. And the panels that they can land on are this less than option, greater than option, right? So they can look at what's on the hanger and they can move towards the less than option, the greater than option. It turns out that when they are trained to say move towards the smaller number option, you can see what happens on the top panel. The bee lands on the panel with 2 objects instead of 4. And if you randomize the actual numbers that appear, so some cases it's 2 versus 4, other cases it's 3 versus 6, you can test how it is that bees can compute what is this, whether bees are able to correctly land on the smaller number. And it turns out that in pairwise comparisons between 2 and 4, 3 and 6, and so on, that bees, which are trained on one of these paradigms, say trained on 2 versus 3, can learn to land on the smaller number even when novel sets of numbers are shown to them. So they're trained on 2 versus 4, they're shown 3 versus 6, they pick 3 over 6, etc. In fact, one paper sort of showed that bees are also able to comprehend that 0 is in some sense a number or represents a lack of number, because as you can see in the bottom panel over there, bees that are trained to obey the less than rule spontaneously land on animals on displays that show no items, right? An empty set. And they consistently pick 0 over 1, 0 over 2, 0 over 3, 0 over 4, 5, and 6 when they're shown these options. Remember, their training has only been on picking the smaller number. So they've been, say, trained on picking 2 over 4, but when they're shown 0 versus 3, they then pick 0. So this is one way to train bees. For example, bees can be trained to, using paradigms that randomize the number of objects that appear before them, to learn a general rule, such as pick the category which is the numerical category which is smaller, or they can be taught to pick the numerical category that is larger. You can also have bees do these kinds of tasks where they make a choice between 2 options, right? And in that case, you can, so you can train, for example, bees on a 4 versus 3 task, right? I mean, you can see then whether, and you can then sort of during training display different sets of numbers to them to see what they choose. And in tests like this, you can actually sort of train bees to associate a particular number with a reward, such that if they, for example, over here, in the 2 versus 3 task, learn to pick 3, if they're occasionally shown 3 versus 4, they will still pick 3. So you can train bees either to learn a general rule of go towards a smaller number, go towards a larger number, or to, which constitutes, again, as with what the chimp did, a sense of the ordering of numbers. But what about the appreciation of the number of items by itself? And so bees can be trained to associate a reward with particular numbers of items. And you can see the results of that over here. So this looks very confusing. So start with me at the bottom left. So when bees are trained to pick an object with 3 items on them, so the left 2 most panels, then you'll find, and you can look at the top panels, a lot more them picking 3. So I'm actually going to zoom out over here to show you this. You can see that bees, when they're trained and rewarded for picking 3 items, they pick more of the 3 item stimuli than 2 item stimuli in tests. Likewise, if on the other hand, they're trained to pick 2 objects, they will pick 2 rather than 3 objects in their outcomes. One sees this kind of thing even if one trains on, say, a blue set, but one tests on a set in which the actual appearance of the object is very different from before. So in this case, it's yellow stars, but they're still able to perform the task in the same way as before, regardless of the modality of the stimulus. It's still a visual stimulus.
I'm sorry to interject.
Yeah, please.
You can see all your screens.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
How's this?
Not any different.
What is it that you can see?
We can see all your screens, as in it's not just the slides. Okay, that was good. Yep.
Okay, that's good. All right, good. If you look at the right, which is panel E, you see that when training is done on 4 versus 5, right, these animals are not so good at the task. And this then brings us to something that we see across various forms of numerical cognition, which is that most animals are fairly good with 1s, 2s, and 3s. In fact, in humans as well, 1, 2, and 3 are called the subitizing range, the range within which humans and animals seem to be able to look at a number of objects and without any loss of reaction time between going from 1 to 3, appreciate that it's 3 objects, 1 object, 2 objects. But 4, 5, and onwards, animals take a little bit longer to appreciate the actual number of objects on a screen. And these are therefore thought to be outside the subitizing range. This seems to involve some actual counting or some other process which is not so quick and not so intuitive. So in distinguishing 4 versus 5, these Bs appear to not be very good. And one sees this kind of pattern across several organisms. So for example, in general, animals do better comparisons between smaller numbers of objects. Given a number of objects between which comparisons are done, animals do better with starker differences in the ratios of those objects. So for example, in general, animals do better with comparisons of 2 versus 3 than 3 versus 4. As you can see in panel D, where the comparison is 3 versus 4, the performance is not as good for picking 4 objects over 3 as it was in picking 3 objects over 2. Okay, so then how is one to understand the neural basis of mathematical cognition? In some sense, all neurons do very simple additive and subtractive calculations, right? I could imagine sort of engineer a neural circuit that does very complex or does at least these very simple calculations. And yet one finds human beings struggling to learn at least some kinds of mathematics, right? And the question is essentially whether mathematical cognition is so rare to find and whether mathematical cues are not used as much as other cues because these might represent ecologically less useful tasks. And of course, now there's some interest in looking at counting time and whether counting time is an ecologically useful task that one can, within which one can understand the evolution of counting behavior.
Professor, okay. So what about the idea that you need to have a brain of a certain size to be able to do such computational tasks?
Right. So bees really represent an example of how you can have very, very small brains, and so bees outperform as of now, based on the limiting testing that has been done across animals. They certainly outperform several other vertebrate organisms in terms of their numerical abilities. There's a proposal that what matters for numerical ability or for really various kinds of cognitive ability is not necessarily the size of the brain, but one needs a certain size of brain to deal with a certain size of body because one has a lot of sensory input and motor output. But the questions, one proposal, at least in vertebrates, is that any extra neural material beyond what one would need for a body of a certain size might go into other cognitive abilities. But we simply don't have an understanding of what this might be in invertebrates. And I think the bee data gives us a good reason to look at invertebrates for interesting abilities of this kind. Okay, I wonder if all of you can do a quick task, which is I want you to quickly do a poll, right? So the poll involves looking at the number of objects that, or what you think of as the intermediate between 2 and 8. Now, I want you to not think about this and do this task instantaneously, so you'll have very little time to do your to sort of enter your response. What do you think is intermediate between 2 and 8? Quick response, and let's see what the results look like. I don't know whether the results show up right away. Okay, most of you have pressed 6, which is interesting, and many of you have pressed 5. Okay, cool. All right, so let me tell you what happens when this kind of work has been done with rats. And the reason the rat work is interesting is because it then has implications for why it is that we must not just figure out what animals can and can't do to satisfy our curiosity, but information about what animals can do is, is perhaps relevant for us figuring out how to learn maths ourselves. So in this case, rats are given, this is a famous experiment by Meck and Church. Rats are given, a tone of sound. And there are one of 2 conditions that they're shown. Either the tones last equally long, but are divided up into a different number of tones. So for example, you have a tone on and off and on and off. So 2 tones played within a duration of 4 seconds versus 8 tones played within the same duration. Or to control for the fact that in this case, the tones are more crowded in time, you have another iteration of the same experiments in which the distance, the time that the tone takes and the number of tones is kept the same, but the time that the tones take to both come on and go off increase over time. And with either of these paradigms, animals are, and in the first one, one's testing really for a perception of time, and in the second one, one's testing for the perception of number. Now, in the second one, the animals are trained on only two stimuli. They're trained to press the left lever in front of them. These are rats, remember, when they hear 2 tones, and to press the right lever when they hear 4 tones. Now, the goal of the experiment is to see what animals press when they hear intermediate tones, right? Now, they're tested with 3, 4, 5, and 6, just as you were. Now, remember, all of you are human beings. You're not just human beings, but you've been through an educational system which has influenced you considerably. And these are rats who've not been through the same educational system. So when rats do this experiment, well, you know, what is the exact intermediate between 2 and 8? Numerically speaking, it's actually 5. Many of you press 6, which is surprising. But that's the numerical intermediate. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? Equal numbers of numbers on either side of 5. That's the numerical intermediate. But when you look at what, you know, when animals hear three tones, they're more likely to press the left lever. When they hear 6 tones, they're more likely to press the right lever. And you would guess that the intermediate is the number at which animals are equally likely to press the left and right lever. It turns out that the intermediate corresponds both with respect to number and time to 4 rather than 5. Now, 5 is the arithmetic intermediate between 2 and 8, but 4 is the logarithmic intermediate between 2 and 8. And this is very interesting because it corresponds to, you know, what we think of as being the way by which the system through which a lot of perception of light levels, sound levels, and even numerical quantity, intuitive numerical quantity are, which is on a logarithmic scale, 2, 4, 8, 2, 2 raised to the 2, 2 raised to the 3, rather than an arithmetic scale. And in fact, logarithmic thinking might be more intuitive than a linear number line. And we really have no idea what human numerical abilities and cognition might look like if one were taught in logarithms initially, and whether you know, one could think of other ways in which we could explore our numerical abilities as a species if we weren't all really sort of corresponding or teaching each other these particular forms of you know, this particular notion of how mathematics should be taught, which is linear first, log later. There's a lot more, therefore, that one must bear in mind while trying to figure out how it is that the particularities of one's education might have influenced the outcomes that we see when we do numerical tests between people. One of the numerical tests that many of you will have done, if you've done aptitude tests, as they're called, not particularly, you know, these aptitude tests are hotly contested as to whether they sort of represent or can be vested with the kind of weight that they are. And so in this case, for example, one sees that the spatial rotation tasks, which are used to assess mathematical ability, the reason that they're used to assess mathematical ability is if you actually look at which parts of the human brain are active during at least advanced mathematical, so the kind of maths that, say, a master's student in maths might do, rather than a starting amateur mathematician. One sees that amateur mathematicians seem to use the same parts of their brain to do math as linguistic areas, which is unsurprising because we are taught math very much as a language. You're first taught the association between a word and a quantity rather than anything else. But advanced mathematical manipulation seems to involve the same parts of the brain that do spatial cognition. And this is why spatial cognition tasks are suddenly these strange objects that are foisted on you in aptitude tests in the 9th standard or whatever. Now, for a long time, even though with you know, nearly equivalent teaching environments for men and women, all gaps that were once considered scientific proof of the superiority of men and women over women have now all narrowed. For a long time, narrowed and disappeared. So now men and women perform equivalently across cognitive tasks. The last cognitive task to fall was this spatial skill. And so men routinely performed better than women on these spatial skill tasks. In 2007, a group of scientists actually did an experiment in which they tried to see how much this might be related to conditioning. And so they subjected players to 8 hours of video game playing, and found that with 8 hours of video game playing, both men and women drastically improved in their spatial skill ability. And the gap between men and women narrowed considerably, whereas if it was a non-action video game, these changes were not significant. This then tells you a lot about how things like video game playing and just sports in general might influence these kinds of outcomes, and the ways in which we make sort of standard assumptions about hierarchies of humans over non-humans, hierarchies between groups of humans, may actually be quite specific to the mode of education and the ways in which these cognitive abilities are elicited, rather than and how training is done, rather than something innate. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly skip over to zebrafish, because these are the organisms I work on. Right, and zebrafish can do simple tasks like this, where they look at two sides of a tank and tell you and move, and can get rewarded for moving either towards a larger number of objects or a smaller number of objects. As with bees, they seem to get stuck with ratios higher than 3:4. Monkeys also can do 3 versus 4 comparisons, or the equivalent 6 versus 8, but not closer comparisons. They fail at significantly choosing one or another in comparisons of 4 versus 5 or 8 versus 10. This is an example of what one sees then. They're able to get significant results in comparing 8 versus 12, which is a 2:3 comparison. But these are different. Each bar represents a different species. They're not so good at doing 9 versus 12. This is a ratio effect in some sense. Likewise, for a given ratio of 1:2, they're much better at this task for 2 versus 4 comparisons than 25 versus 50. Okay, so one of the reasons I'm interested in fish is because the neural computation that underlies numerical cognition is not very well studied. Neurons that represent quantity have been found in monkeys. With monkeys, one has to have a sense of what area might be active before one goes in with, an electrode to try and figure out, and it takes sort of really a lot of time training monkeys and trying to figure out which neurons might be involved in quantitative estimation. And one, finds it difficult to, it's essentially very difficult work. I'd like to work on a species that might yield quicker answers. And the reason I'm interested in zebrafish is because they have transparent skulls. And so there are very nice experiments, which actually a collaborator of mine does, in which they just sort of put entire zebrafish brains under a 2-photon microscope and look at and use reporters in neurons that light up when neurons fire, so that they can look at the whole brain while the fish is performing a task. So that then leaves us with the requirement of finding a task which zebrafish can do. And as I said, we already have some background work that we can start working off of, which is this work on zebrafish. So, for example, one can do ecologically relevant tasks like this, where one presents a group of 5 versus 3 and see, zebrafish show shoaling behavior. They move towards groups of fish. So do they have preferences between 5 and 3? Well, we've done experiments like this. This is an example where the fish have a choice between being in a sector on the bottom, where you can see the fish right now, near a tank with 4 fish, versus the top sector, where there are actually 2 fish flitting around. And you can see that in this particular fish's case, the fish prefers to be around 4 fish compared to 2. But we're looking right now at data for several fish, 20, 30 fish, to see whether there are preferences that these fish have for one group versus another. These are an ecologically relevant task that might give one a sense of how these fish might process realistic, kind of ecologically realistic stimuli. But we also, and there are equivalent results in mosquito fish, for example, showing that mosquito fish are able to show preferences for one versus, so they prefer 2 animals to swim near 2 animals versus 1, near 3 animals versus 2, 4 animals versus 5. And as with all these other organisms, they fail at doing 4 versus 5 and onwards. What about specific comparisons of numbers? Well, we also do another training paradigm in which fish go down a T maze, right? And so they swim down the T maze, a gate is opened, And then before they go down the T maze, they see what you see on the right. They see either one line to the left or two lines to the right. If they make a choice of moving towards two, they get two pieces of food. So we're trying to test for whether they can learn the specific association between two lines on the screen and two pieces of food versus one line on the screen and one piece of food, right? And this is what some of those videos look like. There's the fish, right? We lift our gate, we deal with that dripping water. The fish eventually comes through, sees the screen, makes a decision, goes towards two, in this case, eats both pieces of food, and then eventually goes back. So in initial trials, and this was work done by Dhairya Singh of my lab, there was they were able to find that the fish sort of gradually over time seemed to learn, seemed to pick 2 over 1. However, we find that, again, as with many other experiments, only a small proportion of fish show these very nice results. And one also does various sanity checks. So, for example, initially these fish showed biases in terms of which side they went on. Remember that for this experiment to work, we have to randomize which side they see 1 bar versus 2 bars on. Otherwise, we're presenting them with mixed cues in which side the 1 and 2 are on is also an indicator of where they might get reward, and they don't actually have to do a counting task. We also do similar experiments with dogs, simply because dogs learn these tasks very quickly, and we think it might be a nice behavioral system in which to probe for more complicated abilities. So here's an example of something that's not done in the university, but by students. I think this particular video is from Meher. These are students that are, there's a whole team of students who work on dogs, and right now are working on them at home. And this is an example of a stimulus shown to a dog, where behind the 2 stimulus if they go towards the 2 stimulus, they'll get 2 pieces of food, and if they go to the 1 stimulus, they'll get 1. And the question is, can they learn to consistently pick 2 over 1? So in this case, for example, you see the dog does this. I've shown both videos so that it's clear that when one randomizes, the 2 stimulus may be on another side, and we only count this as a successful experiment if the dogs are consistently picking 2 over various randomized trials. These are the dogs that we work with, are the ones that are being worked on at home. Although when we're on campus, we work with the stray dogs, which are right outside campus. Okay, so that's the team of students who work on dogs, and these are all the students who work in my lab. And I'd like to acknowledge the Ashoka University grant, which annual grant, which enables all of this work, and the DST Inspire Fellowship, and now the Core Research Grant, which will be supporting my future work. I'd like to conclude with that, and I hope that you have lots and lots of interesting questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Now we'll move forward to the Q&A session. Since many of you have posed about similar questions, we'll try and find common themes and address them first. We have limited time, so we'll try our best to address as many of your questions as we can. So the first question is from Mriganka Sharma and someone else. Is there any evolutionary benefit that numerical ability provides? And do you think that the reason why we have base 10 systems in natural language is because humans generally have 10 fingers?
Yeah, actually, Shweta was the one who shared a really nice video with me recently, where I learned about various societies that use non-base 10, systems of language. But yeah, log to the base 10 certainly is tempting to relate this to the number of fingers that we have. If you count on a finger, but as you know, several people, including in India, count this way, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So people think that there are other systems that involve counting off of various other body parts. So for example, apparently there's one base 27 system in which people count like this and then move up the arm and so on. So it's plausible, but one of those questions that's hard to answer with certainty.
Right. The next question is from Biswajit Roy. Why can't it be recognition of pattern and their inherent mapping in the animal brain rather than counting, which is the example? Yeah, absolutely. So the big question that we have to resolve when we do this work with animals is, are they just recognizing patterns, right? So the randomization is really key to us accepting any of the results of any of these experiments. One has to ideally randomize for the shape of objects. So one has to control for shape, size, density,
total surface area on the screen. And since one can't, control for all of these simultaneously, the easiest way to do this is to randomize. So one randomizes then not just the position of objects, but all of these other attributes, such as the patterns. So, for example, one doesn't want these animals to sort of associate this with only a particular pattern. Now, the reason we haven't started doing this in our work with fish and dogs is because we're doing preliminary work just to see whether the animals can do it when the task is made easier. But in order for us to establish that they're counting rather than recognizing pattern, that is exactly what one will have to do. One will have to make sure that patterns of the attribute, etc., all are controlled for. And sometimes they're picking 2 flowers versus 4. Other times, maybe they're trained on that task, but then when they're tested, they're tested on diamonds and various other patterns, which vary not just in terms of what object is being shown, but also in the positioning of the objects on the screen, etc. That's really key. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Anan asks, can animals do addition? Professor?
Yeah, can do addition. Now, the tricky thing, and the reason that I haven't gotten to addition yet, is because it's tricky enough to figure out whether animals are counting. And the addition work is a little harder to believe. But with chimps, yes, we think that they're able to add, and they seem to also be able to add fractions. So for example, you can give them 1/3 of an apple, compared to, so you give them a core consisting of 1/3 of an apple, they can, and you can give them another consisting of 2/5 of an apple, and you can compare that with another apple of which there's 3/5, and they're actually able to do, they seem to be able to do these kinds of calculations. Of course, these fractional things are quantitative comparisons rather than numerical comparisons. There's work on dogs suggesting that dogs can add. Now, it's slightly complicated because, or not complicated, but it's hard to. Okay, so here's the problem. The way that the readout for whether the dogs can count is how long the dogs stare at visual objects. So what in these experiments, what happens is that these dogs are given, say, do I have multiple objects here which I can count? All right, we'll just use multiple diverse objects. So suppose the dogs see 2 objects disappear behind a veil, right? And then the veil is removed, and they see, instead of 2 objects, 3 objects, right? And of course, these aren't all varied objects; they are objects of the same kind. Dogs stare at results which don't seem to correspond to what they saw going into this unseen zone, when the number of objects put in is different from the number of objects revealed. Right. So, but this staring longer at it is the only readout that one has for dog experiments to confirm that they're able to do maths. Whereas for monkeys and so on, they're able to just directly pick which object they want, and those results are more convincing.
Right. So Srijay and Krishna have this question. What's the reason behind the perfect accuracy of migratory birds and dung beetles in navigating large distances, even across time zones? Does it have anything to do with numerical ability?
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible. As I said, we think that navigating time is quite, key, quite central. Because and certainly I feel like we all have some sense of time that's not necessarily related to external cues, such as what's on a clock or daylight. So for example, if I decide that I need to sort of pay attention to something in 15 minutes, I'm able to do that as long as I'm not concentrating on other things. So the interesting thing then is to figure out and it's really quite difficult to estimate how animals are estimating time, because it's hard to manipulate time, right? It's easy to manipulate distance. It's easy to manipulate various other quantities. But the experiment that you saw with rats, where durations of 2 seconds versus duration of 8 seconds were tested, that's an example of when time has been explicitly compared to numerical cognition, and in that case, one finds similar results with respect to time and with respect to number.
Nice. And Kajal and Ava ask, is a reward system required for these animals to display their abilities? And are there any animals that have been universally or largely declared unfit for experimentation for mathematical assessment or experimentation, and why?
There are ethical constraints around experimentation, but mathematical tests are fairly harmless for the most part. But of course, if one's trying to figure out which neurons are involved, then those can, depending on the type of neural recording that one uses, those can be dangerous and not very dangerous, But for example, if you're recording from a neuron in the monkey's brain, then there is the surgery, and it's actually, brains don't themselves have sensory neurons, so you can actually do brain surgery while someone's awake, and really the only thing that you have to do is provide local anesthetic so that wherever the drilling into the brain happens, the skin over there isn't signaling pain. But that apart, these are not painful so much as you opening up the brain, you're dealing with a possible infection. So these are the constraints within which that's done. What was the first part? The question of reward, right?
Yeah.
So the thing about reward is one has to think about it from the animal's perspective. Any of you who are students can also think about it from a student perspective.
I see.
Think about whether you would do various tasks if you were not. But of course, in humans, there isn't sort of a do this maths quiz and then you will get chocolate kind of immediate link between task and reward. One of the failings of the educational system. But anyway, just think about like spoons with chocolate and how much better they would be. But of course, diabetes, etc. Okay, but from the perspective of an animal, it's a question of whether animals would do the tasks for us if they weren't given a food reward. So in general, reward and actually punishment both accelerate the expression of abilities. And in our lab, we don't use punishment largely because we wonder whether stress caused by the punishment would also hamper various forms of exploration and learning, and that's why we don't use punishment. But both have been shown to enhance certain kinds of learning. So in the case of the chimps, they get they do the task whenever they want to do the task, and there is a food reward that that reinforces that the task has some sort of or sort of is linked to something beyond just let me test myself. A lot of scientists have to deal with, or people who would sort of spend a lot of time doing maths have to deal with a less explicit link between reward and the hours that we might spend doing maths. The other thing to sort of consider is that in the absence of, so often when one tests in a way that ensures that the choice is not based on the food itself. So for example, when the fish are going down the tea maze, we don't pop the food in there and then they make the choice and find the food, right? Because our other worry is that if one's learning a correlation between food and an outcome, then fish might just be moving towards the arm of the tea maze that smells foodier, right? Or smells more of a larger quantity of food. So the other thing one has to be careful about is ensuring that the food reward arrives after the choice is made. So they have to learn the association, and so that makes initial training often quite difficult.
Right. So this is the last question of the day, and it's from Anurag. He's got an interesting question. Aren't we examining animal intelligence through a human perspective and in human context?
Yeah, we absolutely are. All animal first of all, ideally, at least some of my presentation would have shown you that what we think of as measuring intelligence is itself extremely loaded and uncertain, right? What is intelligence? Firstly, we're realizing that language plays a huge role in assessing intelligence, because suppose, whales, for example, we kind of tend to think that whales are very smart and thinking deep thoughts, but we have no idea what those thoughts are because we can't communicate with whales. We see this problem with humans all the time, right? We live in a post-colonial world where assessments are largely done in English, and someone may be thinking extremely deep mathematical thoughts, but not expressing them in English. And most English-dependent systems of testing would simply not catch those thoughts, right? And so a lot of intelligence assessment is really, does this person do the task that I think I can do? And so it's very, very hard to think of, and it requires a lot of out-of-the-box thinking to think of what other forms of intelligence might be, simply because we're so tied into our own brains, and we're able to access what the content of someone else's brain is through language. So that's one of the fundamental challenges when it comes to understanding animal cognition, is that we look at everything from such an anthropocentric perspective. And so I'm hoping that some of the videos that I've shown you in today's talk give you a sense of all kinds of abilities that might exist that we're simply not seeing as a result of not looking for them, and not looking for them in new ways. But yes, we're hoping that this I'm going to choose an object that gives me more food kind of paradigm is universal enough that it will at least pick up on these abilities in some organisms who think quite differently from humans. And the difference between sort of Alex and other birds, really, I mean, we have no idea what most birds can do. We get a window into what Alex can do simply because Alex combines these abilities with incredible abilities to mimic language and essentially human language. And we know that there are other birds. Someone's asked about the corvid family, but in the crow family and so on, that can do interesting tasks, interesting sort of engineering tasks, plausibly interesting numerical tasks, and so on. So the sort of world of animal cognition is your oyster, right? If you think of new ways and new animals to test, there's a lot that could be found that we just don't know. And of course, some of this falls in the just satisfying my curiosity, right? I wonder whether this animal can do this or that sort of form. But I'm hoping that the talks also made you realize how learning about animal cognition can actually sort of cause us to reevaluate how it is that we do human numerical training and assessment, right? What we think of as human numerical ability may itself be limited by the paradigms within which we've been thinking so far. And so we may learn a lot about, the ways that neurons can do numerical cognition if we're thinking about assessing these in other organisms.
Right. So we conclude. Thank you for the discussion tonight. I hope our audience has enjoyed the session. You'd be glad to know that we had over 200 participants and over 40 questions. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, I'll try and answer some of the questions which have been asked via text as well. Thank you.
As a conclusion to Professor Bittu's informative session, we have a short quiz to test what you've retained and learned. Remember, the top 5 winners get some pretty exciting hampers, so please stick around. On the chat feature, we've sent a link to a Google form. Click on that. The quiz will close in 2 minutes after the seminar closes. All names of the quiz winners will be put up on Ashoka's website, so go check it out at ashoka.edu.in. We would appreciate your feedback on this seminar, so please fill out the survey that pops up on your screen when you leave the lecture. It takes only about 30 seconds, and it's going to help us improve our future seminars. On behalf of Ashoka University, I'd like to thank all our participants for joining us for the 6th and final lecture of the series, Scientifically Speaking. We hope that you've enjoyed this session and series as a whole. We'll be back soon with a new and revised Scientifically Speaking. Follow Ashoka on Instagram and Facebook for further updates. Thank you once again for your time. Have a great weekend ahead and see you soon. Good night.